Draped in a custom silk gown at the altar, the illusion of the man I thought I loved shattered entirely. The wedding was over the moment his mother seized the microphone, publicly humiliating my dad in front of 300 guests. What she failed to realize during her cruel moment of triumph was a simple, devastating fact. My father held the deed to her entire life. My father, Adrian Hastings, has the kind of hands that tell a story. They are rough, deeply calloused, and permanently scarred from 40 years of framing houses, pouring concrete, and building a life from the dirt up. He is a man who speaks softly, drives a 2006 Ford F-150 that has seen better decades, and thinks a fancy dinner means adding a slice of cheddar to his homemade chili. He raised me single-handedly after my mother passed away from breast cancer when I was just 6 years old. He braided my hair with clumsy, thick fingers, worked double shifts so I could have ballet lessons, and never once complained about the weight of the world he carried on his shoulders. To me, he wasn't just my father, he was my hero. Then, there was Preston. Preston Spencer came from a world that smelled of inherited wealth, leather-bound country club menus, and old money arrogance. He was charming, aggressively handsome, and had a way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the room. When we met during our final year at Boston University, I was captivated by his easy confidence. I mistook his privilege for security, and his family's polished veneer for actual class. The trouble didn't start with Preston, though. It started with his mother, Beatrice. Beatrice Spencer was a woman forged in the fires of high society galas and passive-aggressive charity luncheons. From the moment Preston introduced me to his family at their sprawling Rhode Island estate, Beatrice made it her personal mission to remind me that I was an outsider. I was a cute little novelty for her son, a girl from a blue-collar neighborhood whose father worked with his hands. Construction, is it? Beatrice had asked over a dinner of seared scallops on that very first night, her manicured fingers delicately holding a crystal wine glass. She looked at my father, who had accompanied me, with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. How quaint. I suppose someone has to do the heavy lifting so the rest of us can enjoy the view. My father had just smiled his warm, crinkly-eyed smile. It's honest work, Mrs. Spencer, keeps a roof over our heads. Over the next 3 years, as Preston and I fell in love and eventually got engaged, Beatrice's microaggressions evolved into blatant disrespect. She insisted on taking total control of the wedding planning, claiming that my father's handyman budget couldn't possibly accommodate the caliber of event the Spencer name required. I fought her on it. I told her my father had saved for my wedding since I was a little girl and that he would be contributing. Oh, Chloe, darling, Beatrice had sighed during a torturous meeting with a high-end florist. Let your father keep his little savings for his retirement. We wouldn't want him eating canned beans in his old age. The Spencers will handle the finances. It's what we do. I looked to Preston for support, but he just squeezed my hand under the table. Just let her have this, Chloe, he whispered. It's easier than fighting her. You know how she gets. That was Preston's catchphrase. Just let her have this. I should have seen the red flags then. I should have recognized that a man who refuses to defend you to his mother will never defend you to the world. But love makes you blind. And the stress of the wedding made me desperate for peace. The night before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner, the tension reached a boiling point. Beatrice had rented out an exclusive, private dining room at a 5-star restaurant overlooking the harbor. When we arrived, I realized with a sinking heart that she had arranged the seating chart to isolate my father. While Beatrice, her husband Richard, Preston, and the rest of the Spencer extended family were seated at the grand central table bathed in candlelight, my father was placed at a small, cramped corner table near the swinging doors of the kitchen. His table mates were the teenage ring bearer and an elderly, half-deaf aunt who slept through the appetizers. Beatrice, this is a mistake, I said, my voice trembling as I pulled her aside. My father belongs at the head table, with us. She offered a sickeningly sweet smile, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. Chloe, sweetie, the head table is for the hosts. Besides, Adrian looks perfectly content over there. He's probably more comfortable not having to use the correct oyster fork. We wouldn't want to embarrass him. I was ready to scream, to tear the floral centerpieces apart, but I felt a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. It was my dad. "Let it go, Chloe Bird," he said softly, using his childhood nickname for me. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray two-piece he'd bought a decade ago. It was slightly out of style, but he had ironed it perfectly. "Tomorrow is your big day. I don't care where I sit, as long as I get to see you walk down that aisle. Don't cause a fuss over me." I swallowed the lump in my throat, blinking back tears. "They treat you like you're beneath them, Dad." "I hate it. People who look down on others usually have a terrible fear of falling. Honey," he said wisely, patting my cheek. "Let them have their fancy dinner. You just focus on being happy." I looked over at Preston, who was laughing with his groomsmen, completely oblivious or willfully ignorant to the fact that his family was treating my father like the hired help. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Tomorrow, I would be a married woman. Tomorrow we would start our own lives, away from Beatrice's toxic orbit. Or so I thought. The morning of the wedding was breathtakingly beautiful. The Rhode Island sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the ocean breeze smelled of salt and blooming hydrangeas. The ceremony took place on the grand lawn of the Spencer family estate, a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property that Beatrice never failed to mention had been in their family for 3 generations. When my father saw me in my dress for the first time, tears welled up in his eyes. It was a custom silk gown, elegant and timeless, and as I held my bouquet of white orchids, he took my hands in his rough ones. "Your mother," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have been so proud of you today, Chloe. You look just like her." "I love you, Dad," I whispered, hugging him tight, not caring if I wrinkled the silk. "Thank you for everything, for every sacrifice. Always." "Kiddo," he said, offering his arm. Walking down the aisle to the soft music of a string quartet, I felt a surge of hope. Preston looked incredibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, waiting for me at the altar with a bright smile. The ceremony was flawless. We exchanged our vows, the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, and the crowd erupted into applause. For a brief, fleeting hour, I thought everything was going to be okay. Then came the reception. Under an enormous, fairy light-draped marquee tent on the estate's lawn, the champagne flowed like water. The wealth in the room was suffocating. Women draped in designer gowns and dripping in diamonds gossiped behind their hands, while men in bespoke suits smoked expensive cigars near the bar. My father, bless him, stayed mostly to the side, chatting amiably with the bartender and looking at me with pure, unfiltered joy. As dinner concluded and the plates were cleared, the clinking of glasses began. It was time for the toasts. The best man gave a funny, slightly inappropriate speech. The maid of honor made me cry with memories of our college days. And then, Beatrice stood up. She glided to the center of the dance floor, her sequined gown catching the ambient light, and tapped her manicured nail against the microphone. The tent fell completely silent. "Family, friends, distinguished guests," Beatrice began, her voice echoing smoothly through the speakers. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of my wonderful son, Preston, and his lovely bride, Chloe." She paused, taking a slow sip from her champagne flute. When Preston first brought Chloe home, I must admit, I was surprised. We Spencers have certain traditions, certain standards, a certain pedigree that we have upheld for decades. She offered a small, knowing chuckle, and a few of her high society friends laughed along with her. "But we are also a generous family, a charitable family." My stomach plummeted. Beside me, Preston shifted in his seat but kept a stiff smile plastered on his face. "We believe in lifting others up," Beatrice continued, her eyes drifting across the room until they locked onto my father, who was standing quietly near the back. "Take Chloe's father, Adrian." Adrian waved to the crowd. My dad, confused but polite, gave a small, awkward wave. "Adrian is a laborer," Beatrice said, the word rolling off her tongue like poison. "A man who works in the dirt." When we met him, we realized just how vastly different our worlds are. In fact, I don't think Adrian has ever seen an open bar like this in his life. Laughter rippled through the tent, not warm laughter, cruel, mocking, country club laughter. My blood turned to ice. "It's okay, Adrian," Beatrice cooed condescendingly into the microphone. "Drink up. The Spencers are footing the bill. In fact, we are happy to take your daughter off your hands today. We know it must have been a terrible burden, raising a child in a cramped little house on a mechanic's salary, never able to provide her with the finer things in life. But don't you worry your weary little head anymore. She's a Spencer now. She'll never have to smell like cheap beer and sawdust again." The silence that followed was deafening. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. I looked at my father, the man who had broken his back to give me the world. The man who had stayed up nights pacing the floor when I was sick, who had skipped meals so I could have a new winter coat. He was standing there, his head bowed, his face flushed a deep, humiliating red. He looked utterly defeated. I whipped my head to look at Preston. "Say something," I hissed, my voice trembling with rage. "Preston, tell her to stop." Preston wouldn't even look at me. He stared down at his half-eaten slice of wedding cake. "Chloe, don't make a scene," he muttered through gritted teeth. "She's just had a bit too much champagne. Let her have her moment. It's almost over. Let her have her moment." In that fraction of a second, the veil lifted. I didn't just see Beatrice for the elitist monster she was. I saw Preston for the spineless, complicit coward he was. He was never going to protect me. He was never going to respect my family. He was perfectly content to let his mother publicly eviscerate the greatest man I had ever known, all to keep the peace in his gilded cage. A quiet fury ignited in my chest, burning hotter than anything I had ever felt in my life. I looked at my dad, who was slowly turning to leave the tent, unable to bear the staring eyes of 300 wealthy strangers. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to run away. I reached down, grabbed the heavy raw silk skirt of my custom gown, and stood up from the head table. The scrape of my chair against the wooden dance floor echoed like a gunshot through the silent tent. I marched directly toward Beatrice. She looked at me, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips, assuming I was coming to thank her for her generosity. I didn't say a word. I reached out and ripped the microphone straight from her manicured hands. The screech of audio feedback pierced the stifling air of the marquee tent as I yanked the microphone from Beatrice's grip. She let out an indignant gasp, her perfectly painted lips parting in shock as she stumbled back a half step in her silver-sequined heels. The murmurs of the 300 affluent guests died instantly. The silence that swept over the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Rhode Island waves against the cliffs outside. "Excuse me," Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping its sugary, performative tone to a venomous whisper meant only for me. "What on earth do you think you are doing, Chloe? Give that back to me this instant." I didn't look at her. Instead, I turned my gaze to the head table where Preston sat, my new husband, the man who had promised just hours ago to love, honor, and protect me. He looked pale, his eyes darting nervously between me, his mother, and the sea of affluent guests staring at us. "Preston," I said into the microphone. My voice didn't shake. The hot, suffocating rage that had paralyzed me moments before had crystallized into something cold, sharp, and utterly precise. "A few minutes ago, when your mother began humiliating my father, I begged you to say something, to defend my family. And you told me to let her have her moment." Preston swallowed hard, tugging at the collar of his bespoke tuxedo. "Chloe, please," he mouthed, his face flushing crimson. "Not now. Sit down." "Well, Preston," I continued, my voice echoing off the canvas walls of the tent, ringing clear and loud. "She's had her moment. Now, it's my turn." I turned my back on him and faced the crowd. I looked at the sea of wealthy socialites, the hedge fund managers, the country club presidents, and the old money heirs who had just laughed at the man who gave me everything. Then, I looked toward the back of the tent, where my father, Adrian, had stopped in his tracks near the exit. He turned around, his weathered face etched with confusion, but his posture was straight. "My mother-in-law, Beatrice Spencer, just told you all a very compelling story," I announced, pacing slowly across the polished oak dance floor. She painted a picture of a charitable, high-class family taking pity on a poor, blue-collar girl and her dirt-covered father. "She told you my father is a laborer, a man who works with his hands, a man who doesn't know what a crystal champagne flute looks like." I paused, letting the tension in the room pull tight like a piano wire. "She got one part right," I said, a bitter smile touching my lips. "My father, Adrian Hastings, is a laborer. He started framing houses when he was 18 years old. He worked 70-hour weeks. He poured concrete in the freezing New England winters, and he laid roofing shingles in the dead heat of July. He did it so I could have a roof over my head, food on my plate, and an education that eventually led me to a university where I had the misfortune of meeting Preston." Beatrice lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone back. "Turn the sound off!" she shrieked at the soundboard operator tucked in the corner. "Turn it off right now! She is having a hysterical breakdown." The sound operator, a young guy in a black polo shirt, looked at Beatrice, looked at me, and slowly took his hands off the mixing board, stepping back. He wasn't getting involved. I took a deliberate step away from Beatrice, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. "But what Beatrice failed to mention," I continued, my voice rising in power, "is what happened after my father framed those houses. What happens when a man with an unparalleled work ethic, a brilliant mind for numbers, and a relentless drive decides to build something bigger than a single home?" I looked directly at Beatrice, whose face had gone from an angry red to a sickly, chalky white. "You see, Beatrice, you love looking down on people who work in the dirt," I said, my tone laced with ice. "You think old money and a recognizable last name make you invincible. You assume that because my father drives a 20-year-old truck and wears a cheap suit to an expensive dinner, he must be destitute. Because in your world, wealth is something you flaunt. In his world, wealth is something you build." I turned back to the audience. "My father doesn't just build houses anymore. He builds neighborhoods. He builds commercial high-rises in Boston. He builds luxury waterfront developments in Miami." I let the microphone rest near my chin as I delivered the next sentence, savoring every syllable. "Adrian Hastings is the sole founder and CEO of Oak Ridge Capital and Development." A collective gasp swept through the tent. I saw a prominent real estate developer in the second row, a man who had been smoking a cigar and laughing just minutes before drop his jaw. Several heads snapped toward the back of the tent, where my father stood in his decade-old charcoal suit. Oak Ridge Capital wasn't just a construction firm. It was a billion-dollar, privately held powerhouse in New England real estate. It was a name that everyone in that room, including the Spencers, knew intimately. "That's a lie!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking, her aristocratic composure completely shattering. She pointed a trembling finger at my father. "That man is a carpenter. He's a nobody. You are a lying, ungrateful little brat trying to save face." "Oh, Beatrice," I said softly into the mic, shaking my head with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I am just getting started." I looked over at Richard Spencer, Preston's father. He was a quiet man who spent most of his time at the country club, leaving the social engineering to his wife. Throughout the reception, he had been sipping scotch and nodding along. But now, Richard was slumped in his chair. He looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. His hands were shaking so violently that his drink rattled against the table. "Let's talk about the Spencer family wealth, shall we?" I asked the crowd, watching as the high society guests leaned in, their morbid curiosity overriding their etiquette. The Spencers loved to project an image of untouchable prosperity. This beautiful estate, the luxury cars, the designer gowns. But the truth is, the Spencer empire is a rotting piece of wood painted over with cheap gold leaf. "Stop it!" Preston yelled, finally finding his legs. He stood up from the table, his face a mask of panic. "Chloe, you're embarrassing us. You're ruining the wedding. Just stop talking." "There is no wedding, Preston," I fired back, staring him down. "I am annulling this farce the second the courthouse opens on Monday. You let your mother humiliate the man who gave me life. You are nothing but a spineless little boy masquerading as a man." Preston flinched as if I had struck him, sinking back into his chair. As I was saying, I continued, turning back to the mesmerized crowd. "The Spencers are bankrupt, have been for nearly 5 years. They have drained their trust funds, leveraged all their assets, and taken out massive loans just to keep up appearances. They remortgaged this very estate, the precious family compound that's been in the Spencer name for 3 generations, just to pay for Beatrice's shopping habits and Preston's failing startup ventures." "Richard!" Beatrice shrieked, turning to her husband, her eyes wild with panic. "Do something! Tell them she's lying! Tell them!" Richard couldn't even look at her. He put his head in his hands, staring down at his empty plate. The silence from him was the loudest sound in the room. "He can't tell you I'm lying, Beatrice," I said quietly, the microphone catching the deadly calm in my voice. "Because he knows exactly who bought the non-performing loan on this estate when the bank finally decided to foreclose 6 months ago." The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The guests, Beatrice's so-called friends, the people she had tried to impress by stepping on my father, began whispering frantically to one another. Cell phones were discreetly pulled from clutch purses beneath the tables. The illusion of the Spencer dynasty was evaporating in real time. Beatrice turned back to me, her eyes wide, manic, and terrified. The smug superiority that had defined her entire existence was gone, replaced by a desperate, animalistic panic. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper now. "The estate is fine. Richard assured me the bank gave us an extension." "We are fine." "The primary lender didn't give you an extension, Beatrice," I explained, speaking to her like one would to a slow child. "Stonebridge Financial Group, the primary lender holding your multi-million-dollar mortgage, grew tired of Richard's bounced checks and missed payments. They bundled your distressed debt and sold it off to a private holding company to recoup their losses." I pointed toward the back of the tent. "And the holding company that bought the deed to this multi-million-dollar property, this pristine, historic Spencer estate?" I smiled, and it was the coldest smile I had ever worn. "That holding company is a subsidiary of Oak Ridge Capital, wholly owned by Adrian Hastings." The crowd erupted. It was a cacophony of gasps, low whistles, and frantic gossiping. The socialite elite, always hungry for a scandal, were feasting right in front of us. Beatrice stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest, clutching her diamond necklace as if she couldn't breathe. She stared at my father, the man she had just publicly mocked for not knowing what an oyster fork was. The man she had just bragged about rescuing me from. My father didn't gloat. He didn't laugh. He simply walked slowly down the center aisle of the tables, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He approached the dance floor, his heavy work boots thudding against the oak panels. When he reached me, he gently took the microphone from my hand and set it down on a nearby table. He looked at Beatrice. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. And somehow, that was infinitely worse. "Mrs. Spencer," my father said, his voice deep, calm, and carrying perfectly without the need for a microphone. The tent was so silent you could hear a pin drop. "I didn't want any of this. When I found out my company had acquired the debt on your home, I pulled the file. I saw what a mess your husband had made of your finances. But Chloe loved Preston, and as a father, all I wanted was for my daughter to be happy." He reached into the breast pocket of his cheap, ill-fitting charcoal suit. "My wedding gift to Chloe and Preston today," my father continued, his voice steady, "was going to be the deed to this house. Free and clear. I was going to wipe away your debt, let you live out your days here, and secure my daughter's future. I kept quiet because I didn't want to embarrass your family. I didn't want Preston to feel emasculated by his father-in-law bailing him out." Preston let out a choked, devastated sob from the head table. He realized, in that exact moment, the magnitude of what his mother's arrogance and his own cowardice had just cost him. Tens of millions of dollars. A lifetime of absolute financial security. All gone, because they couldn't resist the urge to be cruel. But then, my father sighed, shaking his head. "You stood up here and showed me exactly who you are. You showed me that you don't value family, or hard work, or kindness. You only value status. And you showed me that your son, he glanced disdainfully at Preston, isn't man enough to protect my daughter from your poison. My father pulled a folded, thick stack of legal documents from his pocket. He held them out toward Beatrice. She stared at them as if they were covered in venom, refusing to take them. When she didn't move, my father calmly dropped the papers onto the floor at her feet. That is a formal notice of foreclosure and a 30-day notice to vacate, my father said, his tone turning to steel. The paperwork was filed on Friday. You have 1 month to pack up your designer clothes, your crystal glasses, and whatever dignity you have left, and get off my property. Beatrice let out a high-pitched wailing sound, a noise of pure, unfiltered despair. She collapsed to her knees on the dance floor, her sequined gown pooling around her, her hands hovering over the legal documents as if she couldn't believe they were real. Richard remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead, a ruined man. Preston scrambled out of his chair and sprinted toward me. "Chloe, wait, please," he begged, tears streaming down his perfectly moisturized face. He reached out to grab my hands. "We can fix this. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know she was going to say those things. I love you. We just got married." I looked down at his hands, then up into his desperate, weeping eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The love I thought I had was a mirage, an illusion shattered by the ugly reality of his character. "We didn't just get married, Preston," I said, my voice eerily calm. "We just got divorced. Do not ever contact me again." I turned to my dad and hooked my arm through his. "Take me home, Dad. I think I've had enough of the upper class for one lifetime." "You got it, Chloe Bird," he said softly, patting my hand. Together, my father and I turned our backs on the wreckage of the Spencer family. We walked back up the center aisle, past the staring faces of the wealthiest people in New England. Nobody said a word to us. Nobody dared to meet my father's eye. As we walked out of the marquee tent and into the cool evening air of the Rhode Island coast, the sounds of shouting erupted behind us. Beatrice was screaming at Richard, Preston was yelling at Beatrice, and the guests were scrambling to leave the sinking ship of a party that was entirely unfunded. I looked at my dad as we approached his beat-up 2006 Ford F-150, parked in the grass among a sea of Bentleys, Porsches, and Mercedes-Benzes. "Are you okay, Dad?" I asked, my heart still pounding in my chest. He unlocked the passenger door for me, a gentle, genuine smile finally returning to his face. "I'm perfectly fine, honey," he said, holding the door open. "I always said I didn't like Rhode Island. Too much upkeep." I laughed, a real, bubbling laugh of pure relief, and climbed into the truck, pulling the heavy silk of my ruined wedding dress in with me. The Monday following the wedding was a masterclass in swift, merciless legal execution. At exactly 9:00 a.m., my attorney, Mitchell Hayes, a ruthless, sharply dressed litigator from Boston's top family law firm, Hayes and Kensington, filed the annulment paperwork at the Providence County Courthouse. Because Preston had actively concealed millions of dollars in debt and lied about his family's solvency, we filed under grounds of fraudulent inducement. Preston, however, wasn't going to go down without a fight. Desperate and terrified of losing his golden ticket, he hired a sleazy defense attorney named Robert Klein and tried to countersue. Preston claimed that because we had said "I do" in front of witnesses, we were legally bound, and he was therefore entitled to spousal support given his sudden hardship. He thought he could bleed my father's company dry. He thought wrong. During our single arbitration meeting at Mitchell's high-rise office, Preston sat across the mahogany table, looking like a ghost of the arrogant frat boy I had dated. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating through his off-the-rack shirt. "My client is entitled to a standard of living he was promised," Klein argued, sliding a ridiculous settlement demand across the table. Mitchell Hayes didn't even look at the paper. He steepled his fingers, looked at Preston, and delivered the twist that broke the camel's back. "Mr. Spencer, you seem to be under the delusion that a marriage actually took place. However, Reverend Thomas Miller, the officiant your mother hired, has a strict policy of requiring the marriage license to be signed after the reception, ensuring both parties are sober enough to legally consent. Mitchell slid a blank, unsigned marriage certificate across the table. Chloe never signed it, Mitchell stated coldly. You aren't a husband, Preston. You're just a man with a lot of debt who tried to con the wrong family. If you don't drop this ridiculous suit and sign the annulment waiver right now, Oak Ridge Capital's legal team will file civil charges for fraud and pursue every single remaining asset your family possesses, right down to your mother's engagement ring. Preston stared at the blank certificate. His jaw trembled. Without a word, he grabbed a pen, signed the waiver, and walked out of the office. I never saw him again. The real karma, however, was reserved for Beatrice. 30 days later, the eviction notice matured. Beatrice had spent the entire month in deep denial, telling her country club friends that it was all a dreadful misunderstanding with the bank. She refused to pack. She refused to hire movers. She believed, right up until the final second, that her social status made her untouchable. On a rainy Tuesday morning, reality arrived in the form of Newport County Sheriff's deputies, led by Deputy Greg Collins. When they knocked on the heavy oak doors of the estate, Beatrice answered in a silk robe, a cup of coffee in hand. When Deputy Collins handed her the final lockout order and informed her she had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before she would be arrested for trespassing, she completely unraveled. Neighbors watched from their manicured lawns as Beatrice Spencer, the queen of Rhode Island high society, screamed, cried, and threw a physical tantrum in the driveway. Movers hired by my father's firm meticulously and legally boxed up her belongings and left them on the public curb. The Providence Journal caught wind of the spectacle, and the next morning, the front page of the Metro section featured a devastating photograph of Beatrice, mascara running down her face, sitting on a velvet chaise lounge in the pouring rain, surrounded by moving boxes. The humiliation was absolute. The House of Spencer was publicly, financially, and socially ruined. The fallout was swift. Unable to handle the poverty he had caused, Richard filed for divorce to protect a small, hidden offshore pension he had kept secret. He moved to Florida, leaving Beatrice entirely on her own. With no marketable skills, no degree, and her reputation in ashes, Beatrice was forced to face the reality she had so viciously mocked my father for. Today she lives in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in Pawtucket, a far cry from her oceanfront mansion. To make rent, the woman who once scoffed at laborers now works as a front desk receptionist at Dr. Simon Gable's dental clinic. She spends 8 hours a day answering phones, filing insurance claims, and getting snapped at by angry patients. As for Preston, his tech startup went entirely bankrupt without his family's stolen funds to prop it up. Stripped of his trust fund and his elite connections, he had to enter the real workforce. He now manages a rental car desk at Logan International Airport. Every day, he wears a cheap polyester uniform, standing on his feet for 10-hour shifts, serving the very working-class people his family used to treat like dirt. And my father? Adrian Hastings remains the exact same man he has always been. He still drives his 2006 Ford F-150. He still likes a slice of cheddar in his chili. But he did make one major change to his portfolio. He didn't sell the Spencer estate. He brought in Oak Ridge Capital's heavy machinery and bulldozed the multi-million-dollar mansion to the ground. In its place, he built the Hastings Family Community Center, a state-of-the-art facility featuring subsidized daycare, job training programs, and affordable housing units designed specifically for single, blue-collar parents trying to build a life for their kids. He took the monument of Beatrice's vanity and turned it into a sanctuary for the exact people she despised. As for me, I learned that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with what is in your bank account, and everything to do with the calluses on your hands and the integrity in your heart. I took a position on the board of Oak Ridge Capital, working side by side with my dad every day. We build foundations that last, and the best part? We do it together. That is the story of how one cruel speech at a wedding brought down an entire empire of lies. Sometimes, karma doesn't just knock, it kicks the front door completely off its hinges. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and blue-collar justice, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. Stay tuned for more.